Well, I've been asked to speak about Bible prophecy today. Two important topics, very timely. The future of the Middle East in Bible prophecy will be what I talk about this morning. And the future of America in Bible prophecy will be what I talk about next. Bible prophecy is a very important thing within the Bible. J. Barton Payne, who authored the Encyclopedia of Bible Prophecy, says that there's 26.8% of the Bible is devoted toward prophetic content. He says there's 1,817 prophecies explained through 8,353 verses. Now the Bible contains approximately 31,173 verses. So that's a lot of verses devoted toward prophecy. It says in Revelation 19:10 that the spirit of prophecy is the very testimony of Jesus Christ. In Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10, do you get a little feedback back there? If we could kind of work on that. That I am God and there is no other. I am God declaring the end from the beginning. Things that have not yet come. Declaring that my counsel will stand. I will give wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those with understanding. God alone can make that sovereign claim. I am God and there is no other. Declaring the end from the beginning. So it's very important to God in Bible prophecy, and it's not often taught. Fortunately, churches like this with Pastor Ken, as he goes through the Word, he does talk about the prophetic aspects of the Word as he comes across them through chapter by chapter. I attended Calvary Chapel, Palm Desert, and I'm from Palm Springs area, and I like that whole Calvary format. They take you through the Word, but when it comes to the prophecy, they don't hold back the punches, and they tell you what's going on. And so today I will be talking about the Arab Spring. Now, how many of you had an opportunity to come to Pastor Ken's December 31st, 2010, New Year's Eve Bible prophecy update? Quite a few of you. I had an opportunity to watch that on your website, and it was a real blessing. And he felt compelled to talk about three wars. He talked about a local war in the Middle East, and he has suggested that could be part of Psalm 83. He talked about a little bigger war, a regional war, and he addressed that could be part of Ezekiel 38. And then he talked about a broader war, contextually, that followed these, that would be identified with the Armageddon campaign, the Antichrist. So I'm going to take some time today to expound upon those prophecies, Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38, that Ken talked about, and try to chronologically order them. I believe these prophecies are stage setting today. Now, when Pastor Ken spoke on December 31st, while he was speaking, there was a gentleman in Tunisia who was in the hospital suffering from self-afflicted fire wounds that he brought upon himself. Mohammed Bouazizi, a Tunisian, a college graduate from Tunisia who felt he had no economic opportunity, who became a fruit vendor, and he tried to commit suicide by burning himself. And he actually did die 4 days after Ken spoke. And his death, his protest death, to try to bring economic improvement into Tunisia, sparked a wave of protests across the entire Middle East. You see all these markers up there on the screen. These are all the countries in the Middle East that have been affected since January 4th on through to the present. And these protests and revolts are still going on. And in Syria, they're very, very violent presently. So we'll be talking about those today. Now, the results of this Arab Spring, your liberal pundits tell you that what you've seen here this year has been nothing more than a youth bulge in the Middle East that has tried to step out through the social networks. They've been Facebook and YouTube. They've been able to step out of the 7th century Islam, state-censored media, and all they're really looking for is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So a lot of the liberal pundits think that what you're going to have is democracies popping up throughout the Middle East. Now remember, the only democracy that's ever really been successful, and is still successful in the Middle East, is the nation of Israel. The Arab governments are run by dictators, regimes, monarchies, and things like that. So there is no real track record that there will be democracies that come out of this. Power shifts change in the Middle East through assassinations, rigged elections, revolutions, and military coups, historically, apart from Israel. So there is a high degree of likelihood that democracies won't pop up. Will land for peace deals work? dating back through George H. Bush at the Madrid conference, on through with Bill Clinton, the Camp David summit, on through with George W. Bush with his roadmap plan, on through to even Barack Obama, who is now trying to get land for peace deals. He wants Israel to forfeit all this land that they acquired in 1967. Land for peace deals are not working. And they have been trying this for over 20 years now. And when diplomacy fails, wars begin. Did Pastor Ken predict something that is about to happen in the very near future? I think he did. And I'll be giving you the reasons that I feel that. Now, when Muammar Gaddafi, the president of Libya, took a bullet to the head recently, Piers Morgan of CNN interviewed the commentator, the newscaster Dan Rather, who's now retired. You're probably familiar with him from CBS News through all the years. Well-respected newscaster. And he asked him, so now that the regime is changing in Libya, what does the future hold for Libya? And Dan Rather's comment was, he who lives by the crystal ball walks on a lot of broken glass. Okay? Well, that was his way of not having to answer that question because he doesn't know. But we can know, because God has written about every one of those populations on that screen, for the most part, in end times Bible prophecy. And we'll be identifying them in these prophecies of Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38. So let's take Libya for example. Libya is represented as Put, the son of Ham, the grandson of Noah, in the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 that Ken mentioned on December 31st. I'll be explaining more about Ezekiel 38. But Libya ends up with Russia in this Magog invasion of Ezekiel 38, includes Iran and Turkey and a bunch of other populations, invading Israel. So what does that suggest? Because there's many people like Pastor Chuck Smith and Joel Rosenberg, a famous author, who believe that Ezekiel 38 and 39 could happen very, very soon. So what does that say for this regime change if Ezekiel 38 and 39 is about to happen? If Libya is involved with Russia in an invasion of Israel that is about to happen, it beckons the question, is this going to be a very anti-Semitic government that comes into place? I think so. What about Egypt? Okay. Tahrir Square, you probably all saw those protests in January and February. Hosni Mubarak, their president, steps down, gets thrown in jail. Egypt's in Psalm 83. Recently, about 2 months ago, the same protesters in Tahrir Square in Egypt were burning the Israeli flag at the Israeli embassy. Now, they have a very fragile peace treaty with Israel that is certainly going to be tested as the new election comes. And there's still a lot of violence and protest in Egypt because their elections have been postponed. They're supposed to happen probably next month, and the military leadership is trying to pretty much maintain the upper hand on everything, and that's creating a problem with these protesters again. So what do we got going here? Let's start by talking about Psalm 83. This is an Arab-Israeli conflict, a climactic concluding Arab-Israeli conflict involving those populations today. When they were written about 3,000 years ago, they were written as the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Termites and the Gigabites and the, I don't know all the names, but this is their modern day equivalents, and I'll be identifying them at length as I get going in the process. They are the nations that presently have been warring with Israel since 1948, 1967, 1973, and have upstarted with these terrorist organizations, the Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinians. They are Israel's most observable enemies today. 10 populations at the time they were listed. Their goal is to invade Israel, and it says they want to wipe the nation of Israel, destroy the nation of Israel, that the name of Israel will be remembered no more. And then they say in verse 12 of Psalm 83 that they want to take the pastures of God for themselves. So they want to take over the land of Israel and destroy the Jews. In the process, they want to wipe Israel off the map. Prophecy written 3,000 years ago that we'll be exploring. That would be the local war that Ken was addressing. The regional war would be Ezekiel 38. And there's 52 passages in Ezekiel 38 and 39 that talks about a Russian-Iranian-led invasion involving Turkey, Libya, and some other 9 populations all together that form a coalition led by Russia that comes to invade Israel, it says, in the latter days. And they want to destroy Israel and take its great plunder and booty. So it's an entirely different motivation that bring these two together. And there are other differences between these two prophecies because some people do try to connect the two into one prophecy. So I'll be sharing some of the differences as we go through between those two prophecies that distinguish them one from another. But you see by their Old Testament names up there, you had Gomer and Meshech and Tubal and Togarmah and things like that. These are not the names of the Psalm 83 countries that I showed you in the prior map. And who they are, the general consensus is listed up there. You know, Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan. You'll see Tunisia's in there, Algeria, Libya, Russia, the southern steps of the breakaway Soviet Union and stuff, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Nuzstan, Grandstand, Takistan. They're all up in there in that battle. Now, as part of this distinction, I coined the term in my book Israelistine, an inner circle. Psalm 83 represents an inner circle of nations sharing common borders with Israel. There you see in the Pentagon, by their ancient names, superimposed on their modern-day equivalents, who we were talking about. Now observe that. Now the next map is, there's that Pentagon with the inner circle, but the Russian invaders, the Magog invaders, I call them an outer ring. So we have an inner circle and an outer ring, and you can see that they're not inside that inner circle. They are spread out all across the map on the broader Middle East and North Africa areas there. So please make that distinction. Now, one thing I want you to observe, as you look at this map, why does Russia need to grab so many big friends and so many big arsenals of weapons and stuff to invade little tiny Israel down there where that arrow from Gomer is pointing to, which is about the size of New Jersey? Well, you know, Russia has nuclear weapons. I mean, why would they need all these big friends to come against little tiny Israel? Please make that observation, because I'll be giving you the reasons I believe they need to amass such a major coalition when this invasion occurs. So that's an observation. A lot of big friends coming against Israel on Russia's side. It would be comparable to if America had to go to battle and invade New Jersey, which is that flashing star there, but didn't want to go it alone because they were worried about New Jersey, so they got Canada and Mexico to join a coalition with them because they were nervous that they couldn't do it on their own accord against New Jersey. That's the size and scope of what we're talking about here. Okay, let's start with this Arab Spring briefly so we can kind of break it down, understand what's happening and how the pedal meets the metal here with Bible prophecies in the Middle East. As I told you, this Mohammed Bouazizi, he committed suicide and he sparked these protests. There was about a dozen others that tried to set themselves ablaze as well in Tunisia. But the president who reigned in Tunisia for 23 years, his name was Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. I don't expect you to memorize that. He was overthrown, and he was the first Arab dictator overthrown by popular revolt. First time that had ever happened that way. 23 years of reigning. He represents a country, Tunisia, that appears to be involved in Ezekiel 38, the outer ring. Well, moving right along to the east of him, in Egypt, you're probably all familiar with the whole scenario that went in Tahrir Square with Egypt, with Hosni Mubarak, who has been reigned over there for, I think he had been there for about 40 years, perhaps, 30 years in power is my note too. And so he stepped down after things got violent over there. And you probably recall just recently, he's being tried in a Cairo courtroom on a gurney with an IV in his hand, because he's old, he's about 82 or 83. There's his two sons up there behind the jail cell as well, in the courtroom. And there's Hosni Mubarak. That has been his fate. He is the one that has had a peace with Israel for all these years, and he is now out of power. And they don't know who the next government's going to be. The Muslim Brotherhood is jockeying for power and will probably win the dominant seats in Egypt. Okay, well, shortly thereafter, now Egypt, by the way, is in Psalm 83. Libya, well, you know, Libya's been in the news recently. These protests started, and Muammar Gaddafi tried to resist, and they turned into revolts. And then NATO issued a no-fly zone on March 18th, and we've been in this war. President Obama went on with NATO, and finally, Muammar Gaddafi has been also removed from power violently. He took a bullet to the head. 42 years in power, and he is in Ezekiel, his country is in Ezekiel 38, as I said. So what do we have going here? We have kings being removed, and we have other regimes and kings that are going to be raised up. We have also had bin Laden. He was assassinated in May, and Anwar al-Awlaki on October 15th, another high up in Al-Qaeda, assassinated. So we have had a lot of things going on, a very significant proportion, in the Middle East. And it's sending a strong signal to Syria, who I'm going to talk about next. But I want to think about this for a minute. It says in Daniel 2:21 that the Lord changes times and seasons. He removes kings and he raises kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those with understanding. That's actually where that passage fits. I think I quoted that with Isaiah 49 earlier. But this is where that fits. But he's the one that removes kings and raises kings. Now, the liberal pundits say democracies are going to come up. This is all about a youth bulge and the social networks that are driving them. There are people out there that think it's a conspiracy of the one world order. They're trying to create havoc in the Middle East. But one thing we do know is that this passage says that the Lord is the one who removes kings and raises up kings. So the Lord may very well have his hand in all that's going on over there. Okay, it's sending a strong signal to Syrian's President Assad, who has been involved in protests that started in February, that turned violent into revolts in March, and approximately 3,000 people have been killed by his regime. Now, Syria is in Psalm 83. Now, Assad has seen Mubarak in the Cairo courtroom with an IV on a gurney. He has seen Muammar Gaddafi with a bullet in the head. And he recognizes at this point he has no hope except to win his battle over there, because he has gone too far. He has killed too many people. At the very least, he'll be tried in an international court. And more than likely, he'll be taken out in the street and shot in the head like Muammar Gaddafi. Now, one of the things that Syria is going to rely upon is that they have a very strong relationship with Iran, much stronger than Libya had. They have a very strong relationship with Hezbollah, much stronger than Libya had. And so what Syria's president said, Assad, not too long ago, sensing that NATO might get involved because Turkey is a member of NATO and they're trying to get NATO involved to come and stop the Syrian protests, because what's happening in Syria is a flood of refugees from Syria are trying to get out into safety, and they're flooding into Turkey, and it's beginning to create a refugee crisis on the borders of Turkey and Syria. So Turkey is saying that we need to go in and do what we did in Syria, what we did in Libya. Do to Syria what we did in Libya. So Assad's response to that, the president of Syria, was, if you do that in 6 hours, I will send missiles into Tel Aviv. And not only that, but I will have Hezbollah, who has approximately 60,000 rockets, we estimate. Benjamin Netanyahu actually stated that about a year ago. He believes they have 60,000 rockets, Prime Minister of Israel. So he said, I'll also call on Hezbollah to rain rockets in there. And I will furthermore call on Iran to monitor the Persian Gulf to make sure that European and American warships can't go through and back and forth. Well, Israel's response to that was, if you send rockets into Tel Aviv, we will take out Damascus. And I'm going to be talking to you about Isaiah 17 as I conclude today, which talks about the destruction of Damascus. It says Damascus will cease to be a city. It will be a ruinous heap. It will be reduced to rubble. And verse 14 makes it sound like it's an overnight experience. So this is how bizarre it's getting over there. Syria has the most advanced Scud missiles in the world. They have the A, B, C, and D missiles. They have chemical weapons, as does Hezbollah, we suspect. Okay, well, I talked about Iran. They are a big problem for Israel right now. There was another area of protest in Bahrain, which is sort of between Saudi Arabia, there's King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. of Iran up there. Ahmadinejad is his name. Joseph Fair of WorldNet Daily says if you can't pronounce it, just say, "I'm in a jihad," real quick, and you'll come close. But he's up there, and their power struggle for Bahrain, it's ruled by a Sunni minority. There's, I'm not going to get into the theology of Islam, but you have Sunni Muslims and you have Shiite Muslims. The Shiites tend to be more volatile. Hezbollah are Shiites. Iran are Shiite Muslims. And Iran is literally trying to take over the Middle East to establish a Shiite crescent over there. Saudi Arabia is very concerned about that, as is Jordan and other places. So there's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Now, let's not forget that by mid-December of this year, President Obama wants to pull out all of our troops, or most all of our troops in Iraq. We had a sizable withdrawal previously, but by the mid-December, next month, he's going to try to pull most of them out. Now, many people are concerned that that's going to open the door for an Iranian proxy state. Iran has Syria as a proxy state, Hezbollah as a proxy army, and Hamas as a proxy terrorist group as well. Well, in January 5th, after we pulled out our first withdrawal of troops, Muqtada al-Sadr, a Shiite cleric who went into self-imposed exile into Iran, left Iraq. He's got a big following. He came back into Iraq on January 5th of this last year. And he hooked up with Iraqi President Nouri Maliki, who is very pro-Ahmadinejad, very pro-Iran. And so there's a concern that they're going to hook up together. While Muqtada al-Sadr was in Iran, he also was supposedly meeting with Hassan Nasrallah, who's the Secretary General of Hezbollah. So you had Ahmadinejad, Muqtada al-Sadr, and Hassan Nasrallah forming whatever kind of plans they have to help Iran form a Shiite crescent. Right now, Israel is so very concerned about Iran's nuclear program that they are flirting with the idea of preempting a strike against Iran's nuclear sites. On November 2nd, as I was sort of preparing for all this, I went on the Drudge Report, and the top 6 headlines were all about the concerns between Israel and Iran. For instance, Netanyahu rallies support for Iran attack in seeking the consent of a small majority within his parliament to have an attack of Iran's nuclear sites. Israel test fires the Jericho missile, which is a ballistic warhead capable of carrying a nuclear payload. And it's Israel's, the nuclear program of Israel, everybody pretty much knows they have one, but they've kept it under wraps. Well, by firing this missile up there, they pretty much let the world know we have nuclear weapons. That can carry a 1,650-pound nuclear warhead and can travel 4,350 miles, a Jericho missile. Now, Tel Aviv to Tehran is 993 miles, so we could go easy into there. And Damascus is only 133 miles from Tel Aviv. Another headline, White House condemns Israel over the settlements. We're putting pressure, Obama's administration, on putting pressure on Israel because they continue to build in the West Bank area. Washington fears unilateral strike. Israel could go it alone, they're concerned. I spoke at a platform on September 11th with former UN Ambassador John Bolton in Century City this past September, put together by the American Freedom Alliance, and we had a dinner together the night before. And he was telling me that he doesn't believe America will be involved in a strike against Iran because former Defense Secretary Robert Gates and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have convinced Barack Obama that the ramifications would be way too deep if we went in and did that. So I said to John, well, then we pretty much have to count on Israel if anything's going to be done to prevent Iran from going nuclear. So he said, well, that would be the only option, and he thought we would have to get used to accepting a nuclear Iran, which would shift the entire balance of the Middle East, cause Egypt and Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons. Many of us believe Saudi Arabia already has two nuclear weapons in hiding in Pakistan. But you could have a nuclear struggle over there, much like you have between Pakistan and India. Very volatile situation. Iran made threats as well, and other weapon threats came up. So there's just a lot of headlines that came up. Now, it's very interesting that when this news was going out, the UK and Italy started gearing up for perhaps such an attack like this. Because what's happening is next Tuesday, the International Atomic Energy Agency is going to come out with a damaging report on Iran. It's being called a game changer. That's going to show that Iran's nuclear program is trying to accomplish nuclear weapons. It's more than the civil program for its people and energy that it's been advocating, but indeed they're going to get nuclear weapons, and they're very close to having them. So that report's going to come out, and all of this stuff is coming together real quickly. And ultimately, I think what's going to happen when this report comes out, it's going to be damaging, and America's going to push for the strictest of sanctions. People will support that, except Russia and China, because China buys oil from Iran. China just sent Iran missiles. Russia provides fuel rods, nuclear fuel rods to Iran. Russia's selling the S-300 missile defense system to Syria, a proxy of Iran. Russia just can't go with this sort of thing. So you have a real cataclysmic scenario. Remember what I said earlier, when diplomacy fails, wars always break out. So it's a great concern that that could be the case. Now, Debka, a newspaper, came out just recently, after all this other stuff was going on, just like 2 days ago, and said that Obama is set to attack Iran's nuclear facilities by the fall of 2012. So, a lot of rumors of war, but the bottom line at this point is that this saber rattling could manifest itself into a real war. So, we have to be on the lookout for those things. So here's the Arab Spring again. And why is this problematic? Because of those red circles up there. 44% of the world's oil comes through those waterways. If war breaks out in the Middle East, and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has already said if his nuclear sites are attacked, he will shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is right there. Its narrowest point is 21 miles, and he would choke off the oil to the world. And so presently you have all, the OPEC oil nations are all over there. Saudi Arabia is number one, Iran's number two. And if they choke off the oil, any kind of economic recoveries in America or in the world, because the whole world is struggling with economic issues for the most part, except Israel, by the way, although they have problems, they're protesting there, could send the economies into a tailspin. So it means a lot to us to be paying attention to this sort of stuff and be watching it, and to know these prophecies so we can be prepared just in case. Now, just so you know, Fox News said recently when Obama came into office, gas was averaging $1.83 a gallon. Presently, 3 years later, it's up $1.61 a gallon, averaging $3.44. Now, a lot of that has to do with this Arab Spring that's been going on. At one point, the oil per barrel went up to over $100 a barrel when Libya was doing its thing. So we have to watch these things. So we have Ezekiel 38 and Psalm 83, two big prophecies to watch for. Now, which one should we be watching for first? Okay, well, let's try and analyze these. Psalm 83 or Ezekiel 38. Which will be the next Middle East news headline, prophetically speaking? Well, if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Ezekiel 38:7, but I do have the passages that I'm going to be going over on the screen for your convenience. And what it says in Ezekiel 38:7 through 9, and what we're going to be doing is Ezekiel's going to give us a description of Israel when this invasion takes place. And what we're going to try to do is see if that Israel that exists today, if it's truly the Israel that exists in Ezekiel's description. So he says in Ezekiel 38:7 through 9, "Prepare yourself and be ready, you and all your companies that are gathered about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be visited in the latter years," so we know it's an end times event. "You will come into the land of those brought back from the sword," which could be a representation of coming out of the Holocaust, the Jewish people, "and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel." This is how we know what population he's talking about. He's talking about the Jews, "which had long been desolate," and they were, because the Jews had been out in the nations for 1,878 years until they came back into the land in 1948. "And they were brought out of the nations," which is what's been going on for the last 63 years. "And now all of them dwell safely." Well, that's an important clue there. "You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops, and many peoples with you." Okay, here's a map of who they are. Remember, that's that outer ring. Meshech, Tiarma, Tubal, things like that. Remember, none of these populations are involved in that invasion, just by way of reminder. That's puzzled a lot of scholars. Why are Israel's most observable enemies today not listed specifically alongside of Meshech and Tubal and things like that in Ezekiel's prophecy? Here's their ancient names listed up there, and none of those names are listed in the set of invaders that Ezekiel talks about in verses Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6 is where you get the description of the Ezekiel invaders. Well, that's very fascinating because it's not like Ezekiel didn't talk about these populations elsewhere in his prophetic books. He talked about Edom and the Edomites 7 times, Moab and the Moabites 3 times, Ammon and the Ammonites 6 times. He even talks about Gebal, listed up there in the upper left, in Lebanon 1 time. Everybody through some name of association, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Haggarites and stuff. 89 times he talks about them in his books, but doesn't mention them once in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And I make this point because I don't believe they're involved in Ezekiel 38 and 39, or he would have mentioned them. He was very specific about who he did mention, and so he's very specific about who he didn't mention as well. Sometimes we have to look at prophecy that way. Sometimes we learn more by what's not being said than what is being said too. Okay, the next verse we look at, carrying on, it says, "You will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go against a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, to take plunder and to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited, and against the people gathered from the nations who have acquired livestock and goods and dwell in the midst of the land." Then it says, "Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods?" So we have a description of the motive of Russia given by these apparent protesters, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and their young lions, saying, "Russia, what are you doing with all this coalition? Are you coming to take plunder and great spoil and booty from Israel?" Different motive than Psalm 83, which I'll be showing you in a minute. Well, I'll be sharing with you next session, if you come, that if America is in Bible prophecy, we are probably in this passage right here where it says Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and their young lions. A lot of people believe that the merchants of Tarshish would come from the UK, and their young lions would be like Canada and America and Australia that were colonized outside of the UK. And I'll be giving you some of the arguments for that in the next session. But the main thing here is we're given the motive. So what we have to watch for here, here's in a summary. They're regathered from the nations, the Jews, in the latter years, brought back from the sword, and all those things probably do describe Israel today. But do they dwell in the midst of the center of the land, which according to Ezekiel back in his time would have encompassed from the river of Euphrates to the river Euphrates in Iraq and Syria to the river of Egypt, according to Genesis 15:19. The middle of that land would be Jordan, probably not just the Israel of today. Do the peaceful people dwelling securely? Is Israel dwelling securely? I just read all these headlines to you. They're worried about, they passed out gas masks to most all their people in 2010. They do turning point drills annually, preparing their civilian populations for chemical and electronic attacks. They can't dwell securely because of the threats that they're under. Dwelling without walls, bars, nor gates, having gold and silver and acquired livestock and goods, a very wealthy nation possessing great plunder. These are the descriptions we're giving in these passages. Israel is doing very well. They've just discovered a lot of natural gas deposits and things like that. But do they meet all these descriptions? Are they dwelling without walls, living in unwalled villages, dwelling safely? Well, Israel presently, and they constructed this 403-mile wall beginning in 2002 after George Bush declared a war on terror. Well, Israel took advantage of that and started to build this partition wall to keep Palestinian terrorism out of Israel proper. And it's a large wall, parts of it is a fence, but they're not dwelling without walls. So if we look at this prophecy literally, that wall is problematic for this prophecy. Are they dwelling safely? I answered that question. The words there, Hebrew words are yeshav v'tash, and they mean dwelling securely, dwelling safely, usually accomplished through a military defeat, where you reign sovereign over the situation. So if Israel's not dwelling securely now, when will they dwell securely? You turn back 10 chapters, and you find out when Israel's going to dwell securely. The same Hebrew words yeshav v'tash are mentioned a couple times here. Ezekiel 28, verses 25 through 27 says, "Thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and am hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave my servant Jacob, and they will dwell safely." They'll build houses and plant vineyards. Yes, they will dwell securely, yeshav v'tash. When I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God. Israel will dwell securely when judgments are exercised around those who despise them. Now I want to take a moment, because as I get into Psalm 83, it's going to seem like, when the IDF show you that the Israeli Defense Forces are probably going to be the tool used to execute the judgments on those people around Israel that despise them so that Israel can dwell securely. I want you to remember that God does not delight in the destruction of the wicked. He loves the Arabs. He so loved the world, he sent Jesus to die, his only begotten Son, so that none would perish, but that we would all have everlasting life. That includes Jew, Arab, and Gentile, and all of us. But God has foreign policy in place. In Genesis 12, verses 3, 4,000 years ago, he told Abraham that I will bless those who bless you. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm going to bless those who bless you, and I'm going to curse those who curse you. He issued his foreign policy 4,000 years ago to the Gentiles. Abraham was the first Hebrew. The Jewish people came out through him, and this extrapolates through the Jewish people today. These populations in Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38 are bent on destroying Israel. Psalm 83 wants to take their land. Ezekiel 38 wants to take their wealth. They are going to curse Israel. God's foreign policy is still intact, even though the international community has no clue that Genesis 12:3 is where we should be focusing right now. It does still exist, and God is going to exercise judgment in prescription with Genesis 12:3. So he will execute judgment on those around him who despise Israel, and that's when they'll dwell securely. So we're going to talk about the Psalm 83 Arab-Israeli war. You can turn there if you want. It's interesting. On July 26th of 2006 in Ireland, in Irish bog soil, an Irish engineer was excavating for a project with bulldozers. It wasn't an archaeological dig with toothbrushes. It was bulldozers in Irish muddy bog soil. And he stumbles upon, stops the tractors, and he finds these antiquities buried in this Irish bog soil that had been written in Latin, that had been buried there almost 1,200 years. It was heralded as the Irish Dead Sea Scrolls. And what it was a bunch of the books of Psalms. And unfortunately, every one of the books of Psalms that they had was fragmented, barely salvageable. They have them in a museum. But interestingly, there was one psalm that was not touched at all, and it was open in place, and it was unblemished, and that was Psalm 83. Well, you had headlines coming out saying that New York Times, 12-year-old book of Psalms unearthed in Irish bog soil, ancient Associated Press, ancient book of Psalms found in Irish bog. But WorldNet Daily had a very interesting headline. It says, Psalm in a bog linked to Israel's current war. Well, that's interesting, because when they found this psalm in a bog, Israel was involved in a war with Hezbollah. It was a 34-day war in that same summer when Hezbollah fired 4,000 rockets into Israel. Now, interestingly, I'm going to show you that both Hezbollah and Israel are listed in the 18 passages of Psalm 83. So what is that, coincidence or providence that this book doesn't get destroyed? That's been there 1,200 years when all the other psalms have been destroyed. And it mentions two people that are in combat together that are in the psalm. There's 31,173 passages, 150 psalms, 1,189 chapters. Here's one chapter with 18 verses identifying two of the participants in a war that's going on. So you had headlines also reading there, Israel mourns, Hezbollah exults, and you can see that one there. So at the time that was discovered, I was writing my book, Israelistine, which is available to you out there on the table. And it deals with the Psalm 83, the epic Psalm 83 Arab-Israeli war that I believe is coming soon. It takes you through the prelude and the event and the aftermath. Now this book has come out 3 years ago, and it has been read by people and endorsed by Dr. David Reagan of Lamb and Lion Ministries, who said there's invaluable new insights. Dr. David Hawking, who said, I wish I would have written it. And Jonathan Bernice of Jewish Voice, a must-read to understand Middle East Bible prophecy, and a most important book for our time, Chuck Missler. Matter of fact, Chuck has recently, about a year ago, came out with his view of Psalm 83, and he calls it an alternative view to the Magog invasion. So I would advise you to get that, because he quotes a lot from the book in there about what we should be watching for. Okay, the Psalm. Verses 1 through 5. Do not keep silent, O God. This is written by Asaph, Asaph was called a seer. He was a beholder of visions. He was a prophet. He was David's worship leader, one of them. He writes, do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O God, for behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people, and consulted together against your sheltered ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. This group wants to destroy Israel, that the name of Israel will be remembered no more, which means to destroy Israel so that you can have no more Israel, you have to have an Israel that you can destroy so that you can have it no more. Okay? We have an Israel right now, as of 1948. All my research shows that this prophecy has never been historically fulfilled. So therefore, it couldn't have been fulfilled until 1948. And of course, they have had wars with the people I'm about to show you since 1948, expressing this Psalm 83 attitude. So it goes on to identify them for you, and I've already kind of mentioned them in the next two verses, the tents of Edom. And it's important to note it's the tents of Edom. Whenever first of all, they're the first person in this 10 populations listed. Whenever you're listed first, normally in the Bible, that means you're sort of the star of the show, or you're the leader, like the Magog invasion. Magog's listed first. The plight. And whenever it's the tents, they're listed in a habitation condition. The tents of Edom. Tents biblically either represent military encampments or refugee conditions. So we have either military encampments of Edom or refugees of Edom. And I'll explain who they are. So there's a list of who they all are there, and I'll identify them for you. And in verse 12 it says that they want to take the pastures of God for a possession. They want to take over the land of Israel. Isn't that pretty much what the Arabs want? They want land for peace. It's very interesting that this really could find application in today's geopolitical climate. Okay, here's who they are. If Asaph was standing here before you today, I'm going to take the liberty of telling you in the vernacular of his time, if this prophecy hasn't been fulfilled yet, here's who he was identifying for us. The tents of Edom, the Edomites were the descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother. We're told that in Genesis 36. They have representation ethnically in the Palestinians of today. Now, not all Palestinians are Edomites. You've got Ammonites and Moabites and Gigabites and things like that I was telling you about. But they have representation in the Edomites. So I believe Asaph was talking about the Palestinian refugees and their plight. Ishmaelites. Ishmael was the father of the Arabs, Saudi Arabia, Moab, Palestinians and central Jordanians, Haggarites. Hagar was the Egyptian matriarch, mother of Ishmael. That would be the Egyptians. Gebal, Hezbollah, and northern Lebanese. Ammon, Palestinians and northern Jordanians. Amalek, the Arabs of the Sinai area. Philistia would be the Hamas of the Gaza Strip. Now, by the way, this is all in my book, these tables, so if you don't want to write it all down. Tyre, Hezbollah, and southern Lebanese. And Assyria would be the Syrians and northern Iraqis. And we just talked about Syria threatening to send missiles into Tel Aviv. So could that catalyze this war? I mean, it very easily could. These are the people around Israel that despise Israel, the reason Israel can't dwell securely, that will someday have judgments executed upon them so that Israel can dwell securely, according to Ezekiel 28. Here's where they are. That this is the land that Israel was given through Abraham. They've never really possessed it all yet. In Genesis 15:18, when the Lord said, on that same day I made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. You can see the arrow between there. There's a lot of land that Israel presently doesn't occupy, but all of Israel's enemies are on this land. So very interesting. They are the ones that will have judgments executed upon them, it appears, so that Israel can someday dwell securely and annex probably some more territory. Someday Israel will possess all this land. And many end times experts believe that will happen when Jesus returns and sets up his messianic kingdom, according to Revelation 20, 1,000-year kingdom. But I suspect Israel's going to get some of this land even in advance of that. Maybe not all of it, but they're going to get some of this land in advance. And I explain my reasons in the book out there, and the new book that will be released on December 1st called Revelation Road. Okay, so how does this work out? Israel comes out of the diaspora after the Holocaust, And they become a nation in 1948, and immediately they have an Arab-Israeli war. And the Arabs told, all the Arab states told the Arabs of Palestine who were living, it was called Palestine at the time when Israel became a nation. They said, you need to get out because we're not going to allow Israel to have its own nation. We're going to fight it. We need 5 days, and we're going to destroy Israel, and you can go back and take over all the cities and communities, and you can have a Palestine, an Arab state called Palestine. Give us 5 days. Well, that was a terrible miscalculation. I spoke with retired General Shimon Peres about 2 years ago. He has been in the 1948 war, the 1967 war. He's an Israeli general of the IDF, retired now, and 1973 war. And he told me in this war, he said, we were refugees with shovels and stuff. And we came against these well-trained, organized armies on the very next day of us becoming a state. And they had fighter jets, and we had a couple of private planes with some hand grenades and some glass milk containers. And we would drop over and try to drop them on the Arab enemies and stuff like that. And they won. So what you had was a problem with all these Arabs that vacated out of Palestine, which is now called Israel, and now you have an Arab refugee crisis. Okay, you have the Palestinian refugees, i.e., the tents of Edom. This was what was created in the aftermath of that miscalculation. So I believe Asaph was telling us that you would have Edomite refugees amalgamated, in this case, in the Palestinians, which is their modern-day name. And there they are. There's a picture of them after that war in refugee camps. That's who they were then. This is who they are today. They're not, they're very serious fighters at this point. There's a picture of the Hamas that come out of the Fallujah, but they are Palestinian refugees. They come out of the Gaza area. So what is Psalm 83 basically saying? They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. There's the list of who the participants are on the right. There's those refugees. And what do they want? They want to take the land of Palestine for a possession. They want one more Arab state, according to Asaph in his prophecy, and they want to call it Palestine. They want to destroy Israel, the name be remembered no more, and have one more Arab state called Palestine. Now, I just ask you, if you're paying attention to Middle East events, doesn't that seem like that's kind of what they want? They don't want land for peace. They keep turning it down, and so they're really leaving Israel no choice but to have to execute judgments around them so they can have peace and stability and so on and so forth. So that's what we've got. Now, I'm going to share with you, and I have this out on my table, there's an audio drama just been released called The Coming Global Transformation. It's on an MP3 format, so you probably can't listen to it in your car. You listen to it on your computer. I was able to consult with Jim Tetlow and Brad Meyer. They hired professional actors, and they talk about the end times, the rapture of the church, the harlot world religion, maybe fueled by Mary apparitions, but they also get into the Middle East. And folks, you could wake up one morning in light of what you're learning on Psalm 83, and you could hear this.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Peter Grant. We're breaking into your regularly scheduled programming to bring you this important news alert. War has broken out in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. I repeat, Israel is at war with several of the nations that surround it, including Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. We have a correspondent, Olivia Markel, who is standing by live in Tel Aviv. Olivia, what can you tell us about the situation at this hour?
Peter, we have reports that the Israelis are fighting on several war fronts, even as we speak. The Israeli news reports that the initial conflict began early this morning when missiles were launched from Syria and southern Lebanon into Israel. Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, is being blamed. However, Al Jazeera TV is stating that the Israelis were first to strike inside Syria, instigating the exchange. In any event, we do have confirmation that at least 2 missiles landing in Israel contain chemical warheads. I repeat, chemical warheads.
Sound far-fetched? Don't count on it. You could wake up one morning and find that they're not reporting on the Herman Cain restaurant scandal with the Michael Jackson's doctor, and you might hear some real news. And that could happen at any given morning. So what does Asaph want God to do about this attempt to wipe Israel off the map? So he tells us in the following passages, verses 9 through 12, deal with them as with Midian, as with Sisera, as with Jabin at the brook Kishon, who perished at Endor, who became as refuse, on the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeb. Yes, all the princes like Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, let us take for ourselves the pastures of God for possession. He goes on and talks about stubble and burning wood and blazing fire, and in other words, an entire defeat. And why? So that men may know you, in verse 18, so that men may know that Jehovah art the most high over all the earth. Show them your God, is basically what he's saying. They want to destroy Israel, they want to take over the land of Palestine, and Asaph is saying, protect us. And so what he's really saying there is that, when he mentions these examples, historical examples, these were examples of the Israeli defense forces of their time who were empowered divinely to defeat those people that had oppressed them. And you got to go back to Judges chapters 4 through 8. And Judges 6 through 8, you had the Midianites who oppressed the Israelis for 7 years. Gideon took 300 warriors and destroyed 105,000 Midianites. Soldiers, his men destroyed the princes of Oreb and Zeb. Gideon personally destroyed the kings of Zebah and Zalmunna. So what you had was soldiers and all leadership, princes and kings destroyed. The other example he uses is found in Judges 4 through 5, when the Canaanites oppressed the Israelis for 20 years during the time of the prophetess Deborah, and the Israeli general was Barak. And so they destroyed the captain of the Canaanites, King Jabin's Canaanites, Sisera, and destroyed that army. And the bottom line is that in both instances, those people that oppressed Israel never oppressed Israel again. And I think that's the lesson here. Asaph is asking God to do like that, so these folks never oppress us again. Are they oppressing Israel presently? Yes, they are. Which is an indication that this psalm has yet to find final fulfillment. So, how will judgments be exercised around those who despise Israel? Okay, it's interesting. We are told in Ezekiel 37:10, so I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. Okay, they were refugees in the Holocaust. Now they're ranked, I forget their ranking, they're in the top 10 of armies. They just launched the Jericho missile with nuclear warheads. They are the regional superior nation in the Middle East. Well, anyway, it goes on to say in passing that, after this passage, will bring the Jews back into the land. Well, this passage gets slipped in and says, make them an exceedingly great army, or they will become an exceedingly great army, standing on their feet. And that's a picture, if you study that whole Ezekiel 37, of the Jews in a Holocaust scenario that stand on their feet, come out of their graves, get restored in the land of Israel, and they become an exceedingly great army. Well, they've had to be because of the wars that have come against them. So I can't get into Ezekiel 37 study, but it's a fascinating study. So what is the Palestinian prognosis if they're going to have to face off with their confederacy against the Israeli Defense Forces? Obadiah 1:18. The house of Jacob shall be a fire. Read that as the IDF, Israel's Defense Forces. And the house of Joseph, also the IDF, a flame. But the house of Esau, read that as the Palestinian refugees, shall be stubble, and no survivor shall remain in the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. It doesn't sound very good for the Palestinians. And again, like I said, the Lord does not delight in the destruction of the wicked. He loves the Palestinians. He just doesn't love them blowing up Jews in pizza parlors and all the things they've been doing. So he has to be, as a just God, he's got to exercise his foreign policy. Okay, what else have we got going here? Also listed in Psalm 83, you have Ezekiel 25, verses 13 through 14. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, I will also stretch out my hand against Edom, that would be the Palestinian refugees, cut off man and beast from it, and make it desolate from Dedan, which Saudi Arabia is in Dedan. Dedan is in Saudi Arabia. They are also in Psalm 83 under the banner of the Ishmaelites. They shall fall by the sword. I will lay my vengeance on Edom by who? By the hand of my IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, my people Israel. That appears to be what that's saying there. That they may do in Edom according to my anger and according to my fury, and they shall know my vengeance, says the Lord. This Palestinian Arab-Israeli conflict has got God furious, and he's going to exercise his vengeance. Appears to be what is being said there. So the Israeli Defense Forces, by the hand of my people Israel. What about the Hamas? Well, there's 1,817 prophecies I told you about, and we've only touched upon 4 or 5, so I still got another 1,700 to go through today. Okay, so Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map. This is their political charter, and it says, these are tenets within their charter. Israel can exist until Islam will obliterate it. The land of Palestine is to be Islamic, consecrated to future Muslim generations until Judgment Day, and there is only one way to resolve the conflict, and then they're not talking about land for peace deals. They're talking about jihad. This is in their tenets. They don't want Israel's right to exist. They don't recognize Israel's right to exist, and they don't want Israel to exist. So what happens to them for their attitude, the Hamas? Well, it says, thus says the Lord God, because the Philistines dealt vengefully and took vengeance with a spiteful heart to destroy because of the old hatred. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, I will stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I will cut off the Cherethites, and I will execute great vengeance upon them with furious rebukes, and they shall know that I am the Lord. And isn't that what Asaph said? When you do these things, so that people will know you're the Lord? Through the Israeli Defense Forces. Remember when we talk about Philistines and Cherethites and things like this, when these guys wrote, they didn't have Jordanians and Palestinians and Hezbollah. So we have to do our best to try to determine who they were talking about. Okay, now here's the big one. Isaiah 17, Syria is in the news, threatening to send weapons to Tel Aviv. Israel's threatening to retaliate against Damascus. It says, a burden against Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. Syria still exists. It's a 4,000 to 5,000-year-old city, oldest continuously inhabited city in recorded history. It's the capital of Syria. About a quarter to a third of Syria's population of 4 or 5 million Syrians live around the metropolitan areas. It will be a major situation when that city is reduced to rubble, and it still exists today. So I don't believe that prophecy has found fulfillment yet. We're told in verse 9, I don't have it up there, but it looks like it's the Israeli Defense Forces that are responsible for the destruction of Syria. And verse 14 says, then behold, at eventide trouble, and before the morning he is no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us and the lot of those who rob us. So at eventide, one evening you see Syria, probably a nuclear weapon goes off, and the next morning you don't see Syria, and you've got floods of refugees going into northern Iraq and northern Jordan. Very possible with the weapons technologies that exist today. You could wake up one morning and that's what Syria could look like. Okay, now I want to talk about Israel. What about Israel in the midst of all this stuff? But you, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they are about to come. For indeed I am for you and will turn to you, and you shall be tilled and sown, and I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, and the city shall be inhabited and the ruins rebuilt. And that's what Israel is doing today. They've turned it into a beautiful place. Mark Twain went back there, visited there in the late 1800s and said, who would ever want to, I'm paraphrasing, who would ever want to move to this desert, arid wasteland? Well, look, Israel today is a very productive country, and they've found natural gas deposits, and they're becoming very wealthy, and they have inhabited the cities and rebuilt the ruins. Now, earlier I said to you, now that we've talked about Psalm 83 and we've talked about Ezekiel 38, you can obviously see that I think Psalm 83 is what we should be watching for. Here's that map of the outer ring I showed you. The Psalm 83 countries are in the Pentagon. The other nations are outside of that in the Ezekiel 38, that outer ring. I said to you, why does Russia need all those big friends to come against little, tiny Israel? I said it would be like this scenario where President Obama would have to say, let's go get Stephen Harper of Canada and let's get Mexico to join us because New Jersey's acting up. They're not complying with my health care program. Whatever reasons, we got to take New Jersey out and we got to do it. But we can't do it alone. We better go enlist some reinforcements. Okay? Well, let's say that the Bible Belt and says, hey, middle of America says, oh, don't worry about Canada and Mexico. We can take out New Jersey. We don't need all these people. It's just a little New Jersey, 9,000 square miles. I mean, it's only the fifth smallest state in our country. So let's say they miscalculate and New Jersey wins. And New Jersey goes over and takes over all the police departments and nuclear assets and weapons and things like that of those people that came against Israel. Now do you think they might need Canada and Mexico to deal with that kind of an enlarged and powerful Israel. Because what the example is here is that if Israel wins and defeats the Arab Confederacy of Psalm 83, they will undoubtedly be considered the regional powerhouse of the Middle East. They will be the superpower of the Middle East. And they will become very wealthy, and they will dwell securely, and they'll be able to tear down the walls. All those things that Ezekiel 38 talked about. And Russia they'll feel the need to get help and to come against that Israel, because they come for the plunder. So that's my point on that. So I think at this point that the Middle East is about to go apocalyptic. We should be watching this. And since we are still in an economic problem presently, that this could be very problematic. If all of a sudden you have missiles flying off in the Middle East and arteries of oil waterways being choked off, so that all of a sudden now you're paying 11, 12, 13, 14 bucks a gallon, having a hard time making your mortgage payment and things like that. So it's very concerning that these things could be happening. So what about it? Are we nearing midnight on the end times calendar? Jesus said in Luke 21:36, "Watch therefore and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man." We are watching. That's what we're talking about. We are praying. We're praying for Israel. We're praying for the many things we should be praying for, our loved ones. That we could be counted worthy to escape, not endure all these things, but to escape all these things. And the only way you can escape all these things is really to put your faith in Jesus Christ. Some of these things may happen before the rapture of the church. I'll be talking about the rapture in the next session. But one way of certain escape, and there's a promise that you can escape them, would be the rapture. Now, you may not escape Psalm 83 and you may not escape Ezekiel 38, but you will escape, if you're a pre-trib believer, you'll escape the tribulation, which I believe will follow after these two events quickly. I don't believe these events occur in the tribulation, but you have the possibility of escaping if you have your faith in Jesus Christ. And that's the only way to be worthy, because it's a gift of God. It's through faith, by grace, and not of works, lest any man should boast. It's a gift of God in Ephesians 2. So let's pray. Lord, thank you very much for the opportunity to study your word. I know these are powerful prophecies, Lord. We hope we're discerning them appropriately. We hope that we can find application with them to steward our lives appropriately, so that we could warn people that your word is accurate and that you predict the future, and only you can make that claim. And you do it because you're a loving God and you want us to know. So I just pray that people who have heard this message today would take it to heart. Remember that the only way of salvation and escaping these things is by putting their faith in Jesus Christ. And we ask this all in Jesus' name.